14 African countries forced by France to pay colonial tax and other burning issues. The Sahel region of Africa, often referred to as the Coup Belt, has been bubbling with activity in the last 3 years. We have experienced coups and counter-coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Niger, and Chad. With the new wave of these military coups in these francophone countries, we are forced to inquire why it is so. It has been revealed and alleged that the African leaders in these countries have been constantly stalked and bullied by colonial countries, thereby making it difficult for them to work in the interest of their own people. Some of the countries have numerous natural resources which could have enhanced the quality of life in the respective countries, but this was not to be. This knowledge has generated a lot of discontent in the region, and specifically the growth of anti-French sentiments, because France was said to have aligned with the leaders of these countries to exploit their resources, thereby fostering poverty. For instance, it is alleged that Gabon, with a population of 2.3 million people, has a poverty rate of 33% when it is the second largest oil producer in Africa, with a high per capita income of $14,000. Niger Republic is also one of the poorest countries in the world, even though it is the fifth largest producer of uranium. It is also alleged that because of the disposition of France since 1958, the French colonies have been scared about the consequences of choosing independence from France because of the foreseeable consequences. For instance, in the words of Léopold Sédar Senghor, the choice of the Senegalese people is independence. They want it to take place only in friendship with France, not in dispute. Unfortunately, France accepted only an independence on paper for its colonies, and instead it signed binding cooperation accords spelling out the nature of their relations with France. In particular, these ties were related to the CFA, France colonial currency, the franc, France education system, French language, military and commercial references. It is noteworthy that the terms and conditions of the relationship of France and its former colonies were well spelled out in the 11 main components of the Colonization Continuation Pact since 1950, and they are as follows. 1. Colonial debt. It will shock you to know that many African countries, precisely the following 14 Francophone countries with ties with France, namely Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Niger, Chad, Equatorial Guinea, Central African Republic, Gabon, Togo, Benin, Cameroon, and Congo-Brazzaville have continued to pay colonial tax to France since their independence till today. The payment is termed for the infrastructure built by France in the respective countries during colonization. My YouTube friends, there has been a lot of controversy on this. How do you determine the indebtedness of the African countries? Also, who forced France to come and colonize the countries? What about the resources that France forcefully removed, or resources removed at a cost determined by them to the loss of the Africans? 2. National reserves. Since 1961, the African countries were required by the Pact to deposit their national monetary reserves into the France Central Bank, who in conjunction with the French Treasury and through the French Ministry of Finance have the mandate to manage the reserves. France's Central Bank, the French Treasury, and the French Ministry of Finance manage the reserves, and in most cases without reference to the central fiscal authorities of any of the West African Monetary and Economic Union or the Central African Economic and Monetary Community. Each of the African countries are expected under the terms of the agreement to compulsorily deposit at least 50% to 65% of its foreign exchange reserves in an operations account held at the French Treasury, in addition to another 20% to cover whatever financial liabilities. The French Treasury invests the foreign reserves of the African countries in its own name, determines and controls withdrawals, credits, disbursements, overdrafts, and the management of the earnings of the investment of these funds in the French Treasury pool. It is alleged that even though the two CFA banks are African in name, they have no monetary policies of their own, and that the respective countries are said not to know, nor are they told, how much of the pool of foreign reserves belongs to them as a group or individually by the French Treasury. It is estimated that France is holding more than $500 billion of African countries' money in its treasury. It is very sad, therefore, that the African countries don't have real access to that money because France only allows them to access only 15% of the money in any given year. And should they require more money, they are only allowed to borrow the extra money of their own 65% from the French Treasury and at a commercial rate. In the same vein, France imposed a cap of 20% of the respective country's total revenue in the preceding year as the allowed limit of the amount of money the countries could borrow from the reserve. Where in any case the countries needed to borrow more than the allowed 20% of their own money, France had the right to veto it. This arrangement was well encapsulated in the speech of a former French President, Jacques Chirac, who spoke on the French exploitation scheme about the African nation's money in France banks. And I quote from the translation, "We have to be honest and acknowledge that a big part of the money in our banks come precisely from the exploitation of the African continent." 3. Raw or natural resource discovered in the African countries. The right of first refusal. African countries are not allowed to seek trade partners to come and buy any of its natural resources found in the land of its ex-colonies, unless France declines interest. France therefore has the first right of refusal before any of the colonies can negotiate with any other country. 4. Public procurement and public bidding. Priority to French interests and companies. French companies must be considered first in the award of government contracts, and only after that are these countries permitted to look elsewhere. This is without prejudice if the African countries could obtain a better deal elsewhere. Hence, all the major industries of the countries in many of the French ex-colonies are in the hands of French expatriates. In Niger and Côte d'Ivoire, for instance, French companies own and control most of the major utilities: water, electricity, telephone, transport, ports, and major banks, as well as in commerce, construction, and agriculture. 5. The supply of military equipment and training of the country's military officers. In this regard, France has trained thousands of soldiers because attached to the Colonial Pact is an exclusive condition for the supply of military equipment and for the expected training of their senior military officers in France. France therefore provided sophisticated scholarships, grants, and defense agreements. They have by so doing alleged to have also trained thousands of traitors who can be activated when needed for a coup or any other purpose. Number 6, the right for France to intervene militarily in the country to defend its interests and to pre-deploy troops. Attached to the Colonial Pact are defense agreements which gave France the legal rights and authority to intervene militarily in the African countries, station troops and military facilities permanently in bases which they run entirely in those countries. For instance, France has 1,500 troops stationed in a military base in Niger, as well as 400 troops in Gabon. 7. The use of French as the official language of the countries and the language for education. The French language is the official language in the ex-colonies. A French language and cultural dissemination organization called Francophonie, supervised by the French Minister of Foreign Affairs, was created to propagate the cause. 8. The use of France colonial money, franc CFA. France has continued and entrenched the use of franc CFA as the only currency for use in its ex-colonies. Its convertibility is pegged to the euro. This is the major cash cow for the French Republic. 9. To send annual balance sheets and reserve reports to France. The annual balance sheet and reserve report must be submitted to France by all these colonies. Without the report, no money can be disbursed to the African countries. Meetings of the Secretary of the Central Banks of the ex-colonies and the Secretary of the biannual meeting of the Ministers of Finance of the ex-colonies are carried out by France Central Bank and Treasury. 10. Military alliance with any other country unless authorized by France. The African countries in general are not allowed to seek military alliance with other countries except the one offered by France. They are therefore tied to the apron strings of France. 11. To ally with France in situation of war or global crisis. It is on record that over 1 million African soldiers fought for the defeat of Nazism and fascism during the Second World War. The Francophone countries supported France against Hitler. France, therefore, knowing that Africans would be very useful for fighting in subsequent wars of such magnitude in the future, and so the colonization pact included this clause for alliance with France in times of war. My YouTube friends, the question then arises as follows. When will this colonial tax be extinguished? 2. When will France stop the looting and exploitation of Africa, which it started since the time of slavery? 3. When will the African nations be allowed by France to manage their foreign reserves and budgets without interference? 4. When will this colonial pact be dissolved? We opine that it is time for the Francophone countries to become fully independent. In this regard, we advise that France should revisit and dissolve its colonial pact with the African countries so that true freedom and democracy will be entrenched. The African nations should be free to determine their friends and their rulership. Also, the time is right to ensure that the resources of these respective countries are properly managed so that poverty can be alleviated and meaningful development is available to their citizens. Such deeds like embezzlement, corruption, financial and economic mismanagement should be addressed and stopped. If you are new to our channel, kindly subscribe and click the notification bell so that when we upload another video, you'll be among the first to be notified. My YouTube friends, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and also